Oh, hello. I think we're live, and that means it's my solemn duty to welcome you to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. For those of you who don't know the channel yet, and there's a few of you who don't, shame on you, it's a relatively new channel, and every Saturday and Sunday I do live streams where we talk about different things, all to do with music. Today, I want to talk about a subject that's guaranteed not to get many views, although you never really know. You only know if you try. And I just need to tell someone who keeps bothering me that I am, in fact, doing a live stream. I don't know how others do it. Anyway, now that they've got the message, let's talk about this weighty, spooky subject, because it is sort of Halloween coming up after all. And this is why does the phrase modern orchestral music or alternatively modern classical music, why do these what phrases put the fear of the boogeyman deep down in your soul? And there's actually a very good reason why. From the beginning to the end of the 19th century, the story of European classical music was one of increased accessibility. Some would call it increased democratization. This was the era when music of this kind, art music as it was called at the time, later people called it classical music as a general term, even though within that there's the high classical period, there's the romantic period, the late romantic period. But let's just use the terms that I think most people tend to be familiar with. The chair will cooperate. And understand why this music became increasingly popular in the 19th century. Several things happened. The music became bigger and grander, not only in dynamics, but in scale and in scope. Beethoven really got the ball rolling, and the person who then took that ball and did a slam dunk was Richard Wagner. I've talked about why on several previous streams, which I encourage you to like and listen to. But the short answer is Wagner was very much a radical who believed in taking high art that would move culture forward to the masses. And the very way that the design was implemented for his great opera house in Bayreuth, Munich, it didn't have boxes that segregated the social elites from the common person. And this really set the tone for this kind of music becoming bigger and grander. And it didn't hurt that all of it was very pleasant to listen to. This was the age of grand harmony and melody. Whether you were listening to Beethoven or Wagner or Liszt or Brahms or Bruckner or Strauss, these were composers that made music to move every person. Because, as I said in one of my videos very earlier on, there is an objective way to understand sound, even though sound, and when we arrange sounds together they become music. It's one of the most abstract of the arts. When we take a photograph of something, it's a literal representation of what the lens is seeing. When you do a painting of something realistic, something similar is achieved. When you write a poem about an emotion that you're conveying with the same kind of words that you would use in your daily life, you're conveying a message, you're conveying information. And that was indeed the first way that we had mass information exchange, orally remembered and then recited poetry. It was the news, it was Facebook, it was X, it was all of these things. From there is a connection from Homer to Homer Simpson, after all, in some ways. And I could go on, but I would say, even compared to architecture, instrumental music is one of the more abstract of the arts. But is it really? I would say much less so than many people think. And to understand why, we can turn to our friends in the animal kingdom. Now, whether you're literate, illiterate, whether you're from a hot climate or a cold climate, white, black, any race, any religious background, when a dog is angry, it makes certain sounds that denote its anger. And no one really needed to tell us that when a dog goes, "Roar," he's angry, or when a dog goes, he's happy. We just as humans sort of know this. The same with cats. When a cat is purring, that means the cat is happy. When the cat is meow, that means the cat is frightened or angry. We know this among many animals. There are certain things that are built into the psyche of all intelligent, or at least most intelligent life, that indicate sonically various information points. And so, if this is true of animals, and if it is true with the inflection with which a person speaks that conveys emotion, it's how, for instance, we can usually tell if someone speaking a foreign tongue is happy or angry. Think of someone doing a video blog. There's a guy called Bold and Bankrupt who I like a lot. He was just in Cambodia, and a lot of the people there didn't speak English. He didn't really speak Cambodian, but you can tell from the inflection, even of a language that has no relationship with yours, you can generally tell when someone's happy, angry, confused, etc. And so, of course, the same is true in music. There are objective emotions conveyed by certain tones, certain harmonic constructs, even certain ways to arrange melody. And this is what made the European classical music of the 19th century not only so popular among mass audiences in Europe and European derived places like North America, Canada, United States, Australia, etc., but it's also why this music continues to be very popular in much of Asia, particularly in Japan, China, Korea, and elsewhere. India is, as even though it's got its own classical music, European classical music is popular there as well. Think Zubin Mehta, a very well-known Indian conductor who then conducted in LA and everywhere else. Now, when it comes to modern classical, first we need to decide when it began. And there's no real point where it did begin, because things do evolve, unless you're Schoenberg, who was consciously trying to do something modern. But generally, the 20th century is where modernism in music begins. And what frightens a lot of people about it is it was in the 20th century when some musicians, and worse yet, some critics, thought that music should cease being beautiful. And by that, we can say it should cease having this animalistic connection to our psyche, whereby we know that certain sounds, even if we've never heard them before, they are denoting and they are communicating certain emotions. The movement to move classical music away from humanness and by extrapolation away from the masses was very much a conscious effort by some musicians and critics who frankly lacked a bit of talent in some cases, or in other cases wanted to make crude ideological points, or were simply destructive. They wanted to tear down this great musical tradition, and in other cases they genuinely thought that by making music ugly they could make some sort of point. And I'll get to some of that later. But the good news for people listening to this stream is that there is a happy beginning, middle, and end. Because while the modernistic music that the critics tended to push was this sort of atonal, dissonant, ugly stuff, and not all dissonant music is ugly, but some of it is. There was a lot of good stuff too. So, without further ado, I've written down my list of people that I think are the finest modernistic composers of the 20th century. And I'm going to start with two to get them out of the way that aren't necessarily modernists at all, both in terms of style and in terms of when they were born and when they composed. But I think they frankly had foots in both doors. And I'll start with Richard Strauss. Now, Richard Strauss began composing in the late Romantic era, and his music was in many ways the most emblematic of that era. But even in the 19th century, he was introducing dissonance in a good way because it resolved itself. It helped to tell a tale, and no one told tales better in the symphonic poem form than Richard Strauss. Of course, Strauss lived well into the first half of the 20th century, where he continued to compose, and while some might have viewed him as old-fashioned, in spite of the fact that he was extremely popular throughout his lifetime, I would say that he definitely introduced modernistic elements to both his symphonic poems and to his operas. And his later work, his final work, frankly, his Four Lost Songs, were in many ways a mourning for what was, but using some styles of the present. It was very syncretic in that sense. The Four Love songs were unapologetically romantic on the one hand, insofar as they were eulogizing the romantic youth that he had lost, the Europe before the war, the happiness before several wars. And on the other hand, there were elements to these pieces that were very much aligned to the times. These were, of course, written in the late 1940s. And so I would definitely say that Strauss was certainly a proto modernist, even though he was quite in that late romantic school. Now, another one of my very favorite composers is Scriabin, Alexander Scriabin. Strauss was German, Scriabin was Russian. And Scriabin is definitely someone with a foot in both doors, the late romantic door and the modern door. But even more than Strauss, Scriabin was someone who really, without doing it consciously, he reinvented music. He was a man of profound ideas about the unity of multiple disciplines of art, whether the visual and the sonic and the spiritual and the ideological. And all of this was really imbibed into his music, which was really good, both his symphonic poems and his solo piano works and his piano concerto. All really, really amazing stuff. So listen to Scriabin if you want to hear what, in many ways, modernism could have become as a whole movement if it remained pure rather than overtly ideological. Scriabin was a genius, and his balance of dissonance and harmony was something so utterly profound and so emotionally stirring that you definitely don't want to be without Scriabin on your record shelf or on your playlist. So now let's get into some composers who are unapologetically in the modern era. And I'm going to start with one that is very, very, very rare, but very, very, very good. And this is a man called Heinz Schubert, no relationship to Franz Schubert, the late classical, early romantic composer of much more renown. Now, Heinz Schubert was clearly a very tragically tortured soul, and you can hear it in every line of the music. It's not the kind of music you break out for a dance party or a birthday party or anything like that. It is weighty and it is heavy, but it is at the same time empowering and stirring. Unfortunately, very little of it was recorded, and many of his the actual transcripts, the actual pages that he composed on went missing because of the way in which he died, which we'll get to in a moment. But luckily for us, the great conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler conducted his hymnic concerto for orchestra, choir, vocal soloists, and organ, and it is one of the finest pieces ever. That luckily is on Spotify and the rest of them. Some of his other compositions have found their way to YouTube in subsequent recordings, and they all have that same very harmonically complex and dark yet inspirational harmony. Did I say harmony? Yes, I think I did. You really need to listen to at least the hymnic concerto. Turn all the lights off, close your eyes, and get ready to be blown over. Now, his tragic style of composition kind of matched his tragic death. He was someone who was friendly with Furtwängler, but he didn't make friends easily, both before and during the war. And tragically, he was drafted into the German army at the later stages of the war. He went missing and was presumed dead. I mean, he was certainly killed in battle, we can assume. And that was the last we ever heard of him. So it's sad that war is horrible. It's sad that a great artist died in one, but definitely check out the music and tell a friend, because more people need to hear about Heinz Schubert. So, moving down on the list, another one of my very favorite composers. This was the Hungarian composer Ernst or Erno, depending on if you're using the Germanicized or the Hungarian pronunciation of his first name, Ernst or Erno von Dohnányi. And he was one of the finest composers ever. He's most known for his piano compositions, and he was a very much in demand and very skilled pianist himself, whether he was playing playing his own compositions or those of others. Luckily, almost all of his composed works for the piano are available on the streaming services. So definitely check him out. His beauty is just unimpeachable. And yet there was something very much counter romantic. There were definitely romantic elements in Dochniani's composition, but there was also something about it that was very modern. It was yet uplifting at the same time, very forward looking, but also listenable. You know that you're listening to something on the newer side of this grand classical tradition, but it was something with a lot of the comforts and beauties that one would be familiar with. His son, incidentally, Christoph, became a very well known conductor. So obviously, music and fine music at that runs in the family. So definitely check out von Dochniani, particularly his piano work. Another great early 20th century composer, an organist called Pietro Jan, born in Italy but made his career in the United States. Now, his works have been recorded, but they haven't been disseminated very widely. I would say the finest work by him is his Concerto Gregoriano. And there's several versions. There's a version for full orchestra that I don't think has ever been recorded. There's a version for organ, a version for piano, a version for piano and organ. My favorite version is one that you can find on YouTube, played by the Scott brothers, Jonathan and Tom Scott. Jonathan is a very, very fine organist, and Tom is a very fine pianist. And they do a piano and organ version of this. Check it out. You'll be addicted. It is such an exciting piece. Again, elements of neo-romanticism, but very modern as well, and very exciting, highly accessible. So Pietro Jan, definitely check that out. George Enescu, a wonderful Romanian composer and conductor, really, really talented man, probably most well known for his Romanian Rhapsody. Stokowski did a great recording of it, as did Antal Dorati. You can't go wrong with either one. Definitely check that out, and the other works by Enescu. Wonderful composer, very modern, yet again, very accessible. I've mentioned Furtwängler before as a conductor because that's how he's most well known, but he was also a great composer. Really, really good composer. And my favorite work that he did is this concerto for orchestra that he did. And this features a prominent solo piano, and this was played by Edwin Fischer. I just want to look up the date of when this was recorded. This is the Symphonic Concerto. I think I may have misspoke. So it's the Symphonic Concerto by Furtwängler. It was composed over a long period of time, between 1924 and 37. And this famous recording with Fischer at the piano and Furtwängler conducting was 37. It's a long piece, one of the very longest. It's an hour long. And parts of it's the kind of piece where when you hear it the first time, you think, oh God, this could be half an hour. But when you give yourself time to hear it over and over again, you come to appreciate that every note really is significant, and that its harmonic sophistication is really, really out of this world fantastic. And the piano playing by Edwin Fischer, one of the finest of all time. He's on my list of greatest pianists. Really, really excellent. Furtwängler also did many other compositions. He conducted after the war, his Second Symphony on record. Maybe more accessible than the Symphonic Concerto, but there's something about the weight and depth of the Symphonic Concerto that I really love. Another great man, known more for being one of my favorite conductors, he's not known for being one of mine, but he's known for being one of the best of all time. This is Wilhelm Mengelberg of Holland. Isn't that weird? Some will get it. He was quite a composer too, but very little of the stuff that he composed was recorded in his lifetime. Performed, yes, but not recorded. Subsequent to his death, a lot of it has been recorded, and some of it has just been re-released in a new kind of anthology. There's piano music, there's Lieder, meaning songs, there are symphonic works, there are choral works, all of which are very good and have this sort of modern meets romantic style. Another great conductor of the early 20th century, who was less on the romantic side and more on the sort of metronomic side, but still very talented. And this is Felix Weingartner. He was a very prolific composer. His music was a lot more tame than Mengelberg or Furtwängler, much as his conducting was, but it's still definitely worth a listen. Then we go to one of the more famous names on this list, and this is Bela Bartok. Now, I did a video on him a while back, and he is one of the finest composers of all time. He was someone who really took concepts of modern harmony, modern rhythm, and melodies that sort of skated just above or below this percussive rhythm and these interesting, exotic, yet warming, nevertheless, harmonies, and really just wrote some really interesting compositions. Definitely check out my video on Bartok if you want to find out more about him. Fritz Reiner was a great Bartok conductor. Charles Munch was a great Bartok conductor. Antal Dorati, Herbert von Karajan did great Bartok. You can't go wrong with any of those. So definitely check out things like his opera, Bluebeard's Castle, things like the Concerto for Orchestra, things like his music for celeste, piano, and percussion. Check all of it out. Wonderful, wonderful composer. Francis Poulenc, maybe not the most well-known name, but his organ concerto was really amazing. I'm going to actually look up when that was written. I believe it was written in the 30s, but let's double check. You can just sing to yourselves while I'm looking this up. So the organ concerto was from, yes, my prediction was right, 1938. And again, while very modern, there were many elements that drew on Romanticism. And by that, I mean several things. We can talk literally about the Romantic European school, the subset of European art or classical music. But what we can also say is Romantic music is just music that stirs the soul. It's music that is emotionally exciting. And one can have modernistic approaches to chordal harmony, to melody, and to rhythm, while still maintaining that oomph, that weight, that joie de vivre, a term that Poulenc, as a French person, would no doubt appreciate. So definitely check that out. Again, Charles Munch, a great, great recording of Poulenc's organ concerto. So definitely check that out. One of the most well-known of all the modern composers, and really one of my favorites of all time, is none other than having a Joe Biden moment, folks. None other than the Armenian composer Aram Khachaturian. How can I say that, but I couldn't say the other thing? These Joe Biden moments become incredibly inexplicable with every passing day. But Aram Khachaturian is one of the finest composers of all time. And in many ways, he was the victim of his own success. His saber dance from the ballet Gaina, and you've all heard it. We all know it. He became a victim of his success because that became so popular, and it entered the popular musical vernacular, even apart from those who would normally listen to that kind of music. But he's a lot more than that. All of his symphonies are amazing. The octatonic harmonies in his second symphony, the dissonance that resolves itself, that melding of sort of that modern Soviet style with traditional folk music of Armenian culture, and even music borrowed from the choral singing of the Armenian church, all sort of present in this wonderful fusion-y mix in the second symphony, also known as the Bell. His third symphony, which has wonderful, wonderful development of melody and of chords, and just really one of my favorite pieces of all time. And it's not only written for a large symphony with a large percussion section, but it's written for 15 trumpets in addition to the traditional orchestral trumpets and organ. There's a huge organ part in that piece. And as some of you who have followed this channel know, the organ is my favorite instrument of all. You can add your jokes in the chat, but wonderful, wonderful piece. The entire ballet of Gaina and the suite that he wrote for it, perfection, as of course was his Spartacus ballet and the suites of music that he pulled from there. He conducted a lot of his own music, including his first two symphonies, multiple recordings of his suites of Gaina and Spartacus. A lot of the music he wrote for Soviet films he conducted himself. And while he didn't conduct the third symphony on record, at least not that I've been able to find, Kirill Kondrashin did a wonderful recording for the Soviet record label Melodia. So definitely check that out. Khachaturian, both one of the most sophisticated and accessible of the modern composers. His idea of chords and harmony and melody, so sophisticated, yet so accessible. And it's that accessibility that sort of gives him a rough time with the arrogant, snobbish critics, but we don't pay attention to them on this channel now, do we? Um, let's just see who else we have on this list. Max von Schillings, one of my favorite conductors of the early 20th century, but he also wrote a lot of music, things like the Hexenlied, a set of songs, but his most accessible piece is a short opera called Mona Lisa. Listen to that, particularly the overture. Listen to the finale, the wonderful end of the opera. Really wonderful. Max Reger, or Roga rather, did a wonderful version of that on record. Schillings didn't record it himself in his lifetime, but definitely check out the Max von Schillings opera Mona Lisa. That final aria, that grand finale. If that doesn't put a tear in your eye and a lump in your heart, so beautiful, then maybe you need to get your pulse checked or run for office. So definitely check that out. Okay, let's see who else we have on this list. Kodaly. Kodaly was a wonderful Hungarian musician. I think he's the third Hungarian that's appeared on this list. We had Bartok and we had von Bokniani, and now we have Kodaly. Now, Kodaly was someone who was, again, one of these modernists, but with the weight of Romanticism. His Psalmis Hungarikas, the Hungarian psalm, if you're calling it in English, is a wonderful kind of symphonic poem with chorus, with solo vocalists. Wonderful, wonderful music. His musical suites were also very moving. And while some of it can be quite dissonant, because of the weight and because of that, again, that pinch of romanticism, it really is nevertheless accessible once you've already taken this plunge into modern music. There's an entire album that's luckily available on streaming of Kodaly conducting his own music. One of the things that I love is, and it's something that we really only get to experience either with very late romantic music or with modern music, and that's the composers conducting their own compositions. So luckily we have Kodaly conducting his own great works. It's on the streaming services, so definitely check that out. Another conductor who also was a great composer was the great Russian conductor, possibly the greatest of all the Russian conductors, Yevgeny Sviatlonov, but he was also a great composer. His music was so accessible. Really, really beautiful stuff. Pleasant to listen to. Wonderful melodies. Not soppy or saccharine, as they like to say, but very, very pure. He wrote concerti, he wrote symphonic works, symphonic poems, suites of music. I would say his symphonic poems and concerti are really up there with the best of the modernist stuff. It's not very easy to find recordings of him. I'm just going to see if Amazon's got anything, because you're going to find everything he ever conducted by that was composed by other people on your favorite streaming service, but his own compositions are a bit harder to find. So let me just do a searcheroo for you, and we'll see what we come up with. Yeah, not a lot. You're going to have to, unfortunately, dig kind of deep for that. You can try YouTube. I think some of it made its way there. Hopefully, if someone out here is listening from Melodia Records in Russia, put it on Spotify, put it on the rest of it. His own compositions that he conducted and his own piano works that he performed at the piano. He was a damn good pianist. Definitely check that out. You won't want to miss it. Um, I want to talk about some great film composers because film became a legitimate forum for great composers to have their art seen. You could argue that film composition had an importance in the 20th century that opera had in much of the 19th. And one of my favorite film composers is Miklos Rosa. Now, and that's spelled. Let me get the spelling of that for you. I really should do that for all of that. It's R-O-Z or Z, depending on what you say, S-A. Now, he is probably most famous for the score to Ben Hur, the great film from 1959, starring Charlton Heston and all the rest of it, filmed in Ultra Panavision 70, which was an anamorphic 70 millimeter process. Very, very cool. Wonderful. All of the stuff that he composed, all of the many films of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that he composed for, have this very harrowing, this very larger than life feel. Again, ultra accessible. Miklos Rocha, definitely check him out. Stanley Black recorded a lot of the stuff Rocha composed for Decca Phase 4 records in the 1960s, really well recorded. Maurice Jarre, the wonderful French composer who's best known for his film compositions. And in later life, he even stepped away from the orchestra as a medium of composition and went into synthesizer music. But his most famous scores were semi traditional orchestral scores, but with a lot of avant garde elements thrown in there. My personal favorite score of his is Lawrence of Arabia, the Dr. Zhivago score everyone loves. The Laura's theme from that score became a pop hit in the 60s. His score to Ryan's Daughter. These are all David Lean films, incidentally. Really, really good. So definitely check out Maurice Jarre. We spoke about the organ earlier, and I've been talking a lot about that on this channel, but Charles-Marie Widor, one of the great organists of the 20th century, one of the great organ composers of the 20th century, he should definitely be on this list. I would say Marcel Dupré, another great organist and a composer for organ, is also someone definitely worthy of this list. Ernst Pepping. Now, Ernst Pepping was someone who was probably best known for his Protestant sacred music, but he also did some symphonic music, and his second symphony was conducted by Furtwängler, and that is on Spotify. I would definitely recommend giving it a listen. It's very good. He's not someone who's that well known, but he was very prolific in his lifetime, so definitely check him out. Let's see, the list is getting narrower because we've got through a lot of them. Satie, Eric Satie. He's the kind of composer where you've probably heard his music, even if you haven't heard of his name. It's been used in so much film and television and even commercials because it's very moody and very ethereal. And the harmonies are, again, for their time especially, very cutting edge. So definitely check him out. In fact, from if you like sort of progressive rock music, Steve Hackett and his brother John did an album of Satie's music arranged for flute and guitar. Really, really interesting. So definitely check that out. Now, the least accessible person on this list is going to be Hindemith. Now, Paul Hindemith was a very interesting person. He was one part philosopher, one part composer. Really sort of didn't go in with any particular musical movement. He was kind of a subsection of modernism all on his own. But it's really interesting to hear music this dissonant and this avant-garde conducted by people like Furtwängler, who did conduct quite a lot of Hindemith's music. So check that out. And there are also copious amounts of recordings of Hindemith, another Joe Biden moment, folks, of him conducting his own music. Again, not the most accessible guy on this list, but not as inaccessible as some of the people that you might consider when you're thinking of modernism. So definitely check him out. Janacek, a great Czech composer. His Symphonia was referenced by the rock group Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and his Gloctic Mass is a sort of modernist setting of a traditional Old Slavonic Mass, and it's also known for being one of the pieces that requires the most numbers of musicians on stage of almost any piece. So that's interesting there. Now, once I drink a sip of water, I'm kind of going to finish where we began, by people who have one foot in the door of the old world and one foot in the door of the new. And this is Sergei Rachmaninoff. Now, he lived well into the 20th century, and so you could, and composed and performed in this era. So you could say he was a modern composer, but then again, he was born in the 1870s. He's in between these worlds. Uh, Rachmaninoff was very consciously a neo-romantic. He wrote in the high romantic style long after we were already into either post-romanticism or outright modernism. But what Rachmaninoff shows is that even in an era when people like Schoenberg, whose atonal music was very difficult on the ear, people like Weber, who actually prefer to Schoenberg, but again, not the easiest person to listen to if you're just getting into it. What Rachmaninoff proved is that the musical marketplace will always gravitate towards something that people have an instinctive emotional response to. And in that sense, I think he deserves a place on this list as well. So let me know what you think. As with any list, I'm sure that I've forgotten a lot of many worthy contenders. So in the chat, please let me know. Send your recommendations. And because this is still a relatively new channel, it helps if you like, subscribe, share it to your friends, share it to your foes, share it right round. I'd like to give the world a Coke. But in this case, just give the world a free YouTube subscription. It's even healthier for you. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. I don't know why I look like the taxi driver today, but I can assure you that the only place I've been in the taxi is the backseat. Send your complaints to the comment section. We'll see you next time. Take care.